Hey there, welcome to the Story Box. I'm R.K. Livingston, and today I'm going to be introducing you to my middle grade novel, Elijah's Boy. Elijah's Boy is a Bible-based work of historical fiction set in ancient Israel during the reign of King Ahab and his queen Jezebel. It's the story of a young boy's journey to faith at a point in history when taking a stand for God could cost him his life. So join with me as we step back in time and let's see where Nathaniel's path will take us. During this episode, I will be reading the prologue and chapter 1. So get cozy and let's begin. The small boy huddled in the shadows cast by the flickering oil lamp. It provided the only light in the cramped room that he and his father shared. He swiped at his cheeks in an effort to erase the marks of recent tears and drew in a shaky breath. The sour smell of sickness caught at the back of his throat, and he coughed in an effort to clear it away. He would not cry. Crying was for babies, and he was 9 years old. It was a moment before he noticed the change in the room. He stiffened and sat up with a jolt to stare at the pallet where his father lay. Only moments before, the room had been filled with the harsh rattle of labored breathing, but now there was an ominous silence. He did not want to think of what that silence meant. No, he would not think of it. The stillness was broken by the rustle of clothing and snatches of murmured conversation from the two women who had come in answer to his frantic pleas. Only these two, when he'd pounded on every door in the village. His fingers curled into a fist as he thought of the closed faces that had greeted his cries for help. What did they mean that a man reaps what he sows? No wonder his father had despised them all. He was right. You couldn't count on anyone but yourself. He wondered why these two had agreed to come. Now one of them was reaching to draw a fold of tattered blanket over his father's face, and the boy scrambled to his feet, still wanting to deny what he knew to be true. He could not tear his gaze from the still form on the pallet at their feet. At any moment his father would toss that blanket aside and shout for something to break his fast with. After all, he'd only gotten sick 2 days ago. He held his breath and stared, willing his father to move and speak and live. But nothing happened. His shoulders slumped. He couldn't change anything by pretending it wasn't so. His father was dead, and he was alone, and the first tendrils of fear curled around his heart. He caught the sound of his name and glanced up to see one of the women look over her shoulder at him with something like pity. He drew himself up and stared back at her. "Go now, and bring water, child," she instructed. "We'll do what's necessary." He nodded and slipped through the curtained doorway into the workshop adjoining the room where his father lay. After a moment, their voices rose again, and he stopped to listen. He heard only a word here and there, something about the rent and debts that were owed. He lifted the edge of the curtain and leaned closer. "No, there's no other family that I've ever heard of. His mother died soon after he was born, or things might have been different. You weren't here back then. His father changed after she died. Bitterness can ruin a man. Soon there's nothing left but anger and hate. I doubt anyone in this village will mourn overmuch at his passing, except perhaps that boy out there." "Well, who will settle the debts and pay for his burial? There's certainly not much that can be sold. The tools, perhaps, and of course the boy himself. There may be someone willing to buy a slave in Samaria. They might take him for the temple." The boy drew back with a gasp and dropped the curtain. He froze, waiting to see if either of the women noticed the sound or the slight flutter as the curtain settled and went still. The fear he'd only begun to taste was now blossoming into panic. He'd rather starve than go to the temple of Baal. He knew the stories. What if they decided to burn him? There'd be no one to speak for him. Who would care if a slave became a sacrifice to that bloodthirsty god? The muffled conversation in the other room continued without a pause. What could he do? There was no time to lose. Ignoring his father's few tools scattered on the workbench, the boy caught up an old blanket left lying where it had fallen. He was careful to make no sound as he wrapped up the remains of a loaf of bread, along with a knife small enough to fit his hand. He gathered those few small possessions he thought he could carry, including the water skin he'd been sent to fill. When he was ready, he crept on silent feet to the outer door. There he hesitated a moment, almost overcome by the feeling of desolation that swept over him. He looked back once at the curtain behind which his father lay, but he did not linger. At any moment, the women would begin to wonder what was keeping him. If he was going to escape, it had to be now. Taking a deep breath that was almost a sob, he slipped out into the silent night. Chapter 1, 3 years later. It was late, and the city of Samaria was clothed in darkness, except where an occasional torch illuminated a doorway. Nathanael made his way through the narrow streets, keeping to the shadows and avoiding open spaces as much as possible. This was no time to be careless. A boy on the streets at this hour would raise too many questions if he were seen. Not much further now. He rested for a moment with his back against a rough stone wall behind him, his thoughts drifting to the conversation he'd overheard near the city gates as dusk was falling. 2 shopkeepers were discussing a rich merchant, one Hyle of Bethel, who had arrived just as the gates were closing and had chosen to camp outside the walls. The merchant would probably be entering the marketplace in the morning, the boy reasoned. He grinned to himself when he considered the prospect of earning a few coins by making himself useful to this Hyle, especially if he was a stranger to the city. He took the time to peer around the corner before moving on. There would be time enough to think of tomorrow, once he reached his goal. Right now, he needed his wits about him. He set off once more in the direction of one of the storehouses that lay empty because of the drought. It was a good place to sleep, and safer than staying outside all night. He froze as a door burst open and 2 men staggered into the street ahead of him. Music and laughter spilled out into the night before the door closed with a dull thud. The 2 revelers turned and, clutching each other for support, began making their way straight toward him. "Oh no," Nathanael groaned. He backed into a darkened archway, his attention on the men in the street. Perhaps they hadn't seen him. He was unprepared when, out of the darkness behind him, a man's burly arm shot out, catching him in an iron grip and clamping a hand over his mouth to keep him from shouting. Instead of struggling, he let his body go limp, becoming a dead weight in his captor's arms. The man grunted in surprise and shifted his grip. When the hand covering his face slipped just enough to free his mouth, Nathanael bit down hard on the soft flesh between thumb and forefinger. There was a yelp of pain, and the boy began to twist and turn, lashing out with both feet. In desperation, he flung his head back and felt his skull connect with what had to be the man's chin. His attacker let out a muffled curse as his victim broke free and dashed headlong into the street. Much to his dismay, Nathanael collided with the 2 men he'd been trying to avoid in the first place, and all 3 went down in a clumsy heap. He struggled to free himself from the tangle while they cried out as though they were being murdered. The clamor increased as several men came running to help them. In all the confusion, he didn't see who grabbed him and set him on his feet in the wavering torchlight. "What was all that shouting for? He's only a boy," one of the rescuers scoffed. "It's a sad day when 2 grown men can't handle a lad his size." A ripple of laughter stirred the crowd. "It's a good thing we came, or he might have killed you both." Nathanael scanned the faces around him. He was convinced that his unseen attacker was long gone. If the man was a thief, then the 2 men in the road had probably been his real target, and the boy's unexpected presence had spoiled his plan. He wished he could disappear as well, and was just thinking of doing that very thing when he recognized the uniform of one of the soldiers that patrolled the city. The man was staring right at him, and Nathanael knew that if he ran, it would only make matters worse. The soldier already looked suspicious. After all, he was a boy in a place he had no business being at this hour. If it was discovered that he had no home or family, he'd find himself in a cell by morning. He had to pretend innocence and do his best to bluff his way out of this mess. Could this night get any worse? He stepped right up to the 2 men he had knocked down and did his best imitation of a humble bow. "Please forgive me, sirs," he said. "It was an accident, and I meant no harm." "Fool! Idiot!" growled one of the men. "Watch where you're going next time." He turned and pushed his way through the crowd with his companion close behind. The others began to drift away also, and Nathanael, seeing his chance, made a move to follow. "Not so fast! Stop where you are, boy!" grated a man's voice. Nathanael felt a strange tingling at the back of his neck. He turned slowly to face the soldier, making certain his face wore a look of puzzled surprise. "I want some answers from you," the soldier demanded, "and I want the truth." Those who had been leaving now turned back, their faces alive with curiosity. Nathanael looked up at the grim-faced soldier. The man stood as though carved of stone, one hand resting on the hilt of the dagger belted at his waist. His voice cracked like a whip. "Your name and your business, boy, and be quick." "I have nothing to hide," he insisted, squaring his shoulders and lifting his chin. His thoughts were racing, his heart pounding, but he tried to appear calm. He could almost hear the faint echo of his father's voice long ago, telling him, "We do whatever we must in order to survive." Well, he would have to lie, and it wouldn't be the first time. "My name is Nathaniel. I had a message to deliver, and I'm on my way home now." "It's an odd hour to send a child on an errand, I think," said the soldier. "There was no one else to send," he retorted. "I would have been home long ago, only—" He hesitated, pretending embarrassment and looking at the ground to buy time. "Speak up," snapped the soldier. "Yes, well, there's a tavern not far from the Street of the Potters. I was passing when the door opened and, well, there was a woman dancing." His head snapped up when one of the men holding a torch let out a shout of laughter. "I only meant to watch for a moment," he added, feeling a flush creep up his neck to his cheeks. The soldier was not satisfied. "How do I know you're not a runaway slave?" he questioned. "Where is this home of yours?" "It's the home of Abner, in the Street of the Bakers," Nathaniel responded without hesitation. This was getting complicated. Abner's name was the first to come to mind. "Wait a minute," cried one of the watchers. "I know this baker. You're no son of his. He has only daughters." A murmur arose, and Nathaniel, feeling cornered, spoke up once more. "I never said Abner was my father. He's my uncle. I'm the son of his wife's brother, and I was sent to live with him so he could teach me his trade." There was a pause, and Nathaniel hoped his lies were convincing enough. He groaned as the soldier strode forward and caught him by the arm. "Come then, boy, it's my duty to see that you get safely home to this uncle of yours." Nathaniel had no choice but to go along, becoming more anxious with every step. He had done errands for Abner in the past to earn a few coins, but that was as far as it went. He wondered if Abner's wife even had a brother. It didn't matter because Abner believed him to be the son of someone named Seth, a laborer, who worked in the royal stables. He'd had to invent that story to get the man to hire him. This was turning into a disaster. "It's all going to come undone," thought Nathaniel. "Once they know I've been lying, it won't take long for the soldier to discover the truth. After all, Abner barely knows me, and Seth doesn't even exist. I've got to think of something." At last, they stood at the entrance to Abner's shop. The soldier hammered on the heavy door with the hilt of his long dagger, making a racket that was sure to wake the whole neighborhood. Abner himself came to the door, demanding to know what all the fuss was about, and the soldier stepped inside, dragging Nathaniel with him. The baker looked from one to the other and back again. "Nathaniel, what—" he began with a frown. Nathaniel did the only thing he could do. "Uncle Abner," he cried, "I know I should have been home hours ago, but I can explain. I delivered the message just as you asked, and—" "This boy is your nephew?" interrupted the soldier with a flick of his hand. Abner's sharp gaze met the boy's pleading eyes, and Nathaniel held his breath. "Nathaniel," Abner said with a scowl, drawing his brows together, "if you've disgraced my house, it will go hard with you." He turned to the soldier. "If he's committed no crime, release him. He has more than enough explaining to do." "He is your nephew, then?" the soldier persisted as he released his hold on the boy's arm. "Indeed," answered the baker with only the slightest hesitation. The soldier nodded and turned on his heel without another word. Abner closed and bolted the door behind him, and Nathaniel let out his breath in an explosive sigh. He wasn't sure what to think. Why had Abner decided to help him? Whatever the reason, he owed this man a debt of gratitude. Never had he had such a narrow escape. "Thank you," he said, not quite meeting the baker's eyes. "You've done me a great service, and somehow I'll find a way to repay you." He took a step toward the door, but Abner stopped him with an upraised hand. "There's no need for you to leave," he said. "I want to talk to you." "I suppose you want an explanation," said the boy in a low voice. "Am I right to assume that you are not the son of Seth, as you led me to believe?" Nathaniel squirmed a little when he met Abner's gaze. "My father's dead," he admitted. "If that's the truth, why should you try to hide it?" "What of your mother?" the baker asked. Nathaniel shook his head and tried to swallow the sudden constriction in his throat. After a moment, Abner nodded. "I see," he said. "So you're alone then?" "Well, I suppose that explains it. You know the authorities will make a slave of you if you have no one to speak for you." Nathaniel tensed. What would Abner do now that he knew? He eyed the baker and said nothing, not sure how much to trust him. Abner stared off into the distance and pursed his lips in thought. When he looked back at Nathaniel, he cleared his throat and rubbed at his chin before speaking. "I have no son, you know. My daughters have married, and Leah and I are alone. I've been thinking for some time that I could use an apprentice. You could live right here." He paused and waited for some response. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. What did it mean? Abner had a reputation as a shrewd man. Did he mean to offer him a secure place in exchange for whatever labor he could get out of him? Was that so very different from the slavery he feared? He thought back to his previous dealings with Abner. He'd always seemed too kind to treat an apprentice like a slave, so perhaps there was nothing to fear. Then he thought about Leah, the baker's wife. The few times he'd encountered her in the shop, she'd rush over like a whirlwind to fuss over him, patting him on the head, pinching his cheeks before he could escape. She wasn't easy to avoid, and on top of that, she never seemed to stop talking. There'd be no escape if he actually lived here. No escape at all. He could feel the walls closing in on him, and he began to sweat. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but his thoughts were spinning. "I can't do it," he cried, a note of panic in his voice. He tried to soften his tone. I don't wish to seem ungrateful, but I'm not unhappy with my life. I've managed to keep my secret for 3 years now, and thanks to you, I can go on keeping it. Being on my own suits me. I have everything I need. I'm sure you can find a better apprentice." Abner sighed. "I could force you to stay, but I won't. I think it's foolish of you. But if you wish to continue your dangerous game, it's your choice. I won't betray you, but take care, and remember my offer if you change your mind." He grasped the lamp from the heavy table and moved to a curtained doorway at the rear of the shop. "I'll give you a place to sleep for tonight," he said. Nathaniel suddenly realized how tired he was and turned to follow. The rear door of the shop opened into an enclosed courtyard. He glanced at a row of 4 tall, rounded clay ovens that stood along the wall at his left. The faint smell of fresh bread lingered in the air, making his mouth water. On the right was the house itself. Nathaniel looked up at the darkened windows on the second floor. There were none on the lower level. Abner paused at the foot of a narrow stair that led to the flat roof above. "My wife's asleep inside," he said softly. "We will not disturb her. It's a warm night, and you can sleep on the roof." All of the homes in Samaria had these flat roofs, though Nathaniel had never been on one. He'd seen how families would gather on the rooftops every evening to relax and enjoy the cooler air. When they reached the top of the stairs, he looked around in curiosity. Abner's roof was surrounded on all sides by a low wall. In one corner stood a loom with a small stool set before it. There were woven grass mats underfoot and 2 or 3 soft pallets. The baker gestured to the nearest of these before turning back down the stairs, leaving Nathaniel alone at last. What a night this has been! He hoped he would not come to regret saying no to Abner's surprising offer. He removed his sandals and loosened the strip of coarse cloth wound around his waist over his short tunic. Before he set the strip of cloth aside, he pulled a leather pouch from its folds and tucked it next to his heart for safekeeping. There wasn't much in it. A few copper pieces and 1 of silver, a knife, a piece of flint, and a small ivory comb that had been his mother's. He wasn't about to risk losing it while he slept, although he supposed there wasn't much danger of that in this place. His gaze drifted to the canopy of stars above him, and he sighed in contentment. He was safe for the moment, and that was more than he had any right to expect. He pictured the couple asleep in the house below him and shook his head. Abner meant well, he thought. It just wouldn't work. He wouldn't be able to breathe living here with the 2 of them. No, it would be better to go back to his life on the streets. It had its dangers, but at least it was familiar, and he could do as he pleased. He would just have to be more careful. His last thought before sleep took him was of the rich merchant he planned to offer his services to in the morning. He must find some way to meet him. And that's where we'll leave off for today. Join me next time for episode 2 as we find out what happens when Nathaniel tries to approach Hyle in the marketplace. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed today's episode. If you're interested in purchasing any of my books, you can find them at www.rklivingston.com or at amazon.ca or .com. If you'd like to follow me on Facebook, you can find me at author.r.k.livingston. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Until next time, keep dreaming, and God bless.